2 in the morning, the weapons storage area at Ramstein Air Base. Master Sergeant Elias Thorn stared at a flickering green line on his terminal that should have been flat. Something was breathing inside Vault 7, and it had been breathing there for exactly 3 hours. The air in the concrete bunker was recycled and chilled to a constant 40 degrees. Outside, the cold German rain lashed against the reinforced steel doors, but inside, the silence was absolute. Thorn leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He adjusted the gain on the biometric sensor, his breath hitching in his chest. The waveform was steady and rhythmic, the slow pulse of a human being at rest. Then, a second line appeared, then a third. 4 distinct heartbeats were pulsing from the center of the most secure nuclear storage facility in Europe. The realization hit him, like a physical blow to the stomach. The perimeter was cold. The alarms had never tripped. The enemy was already inside the wire. 20 feet below the surface, deep within the heart of Vault 7, 4 men in gray-green camouflage sat in total darkness. They were Russian Spetsnaz, operators from the elite Zaslon unit. They were ghosts in the machine. They had moved through the perimeter fences, the infrared sensors, and the 3-ton blast doors without triggering a single sensor. They were professional. They were silent. They were invisible. Each man wore a specialized suit designed to mask thermal signatures. They sat surrounded by the gray metal casings of B-61 tactical nuclear bombs. Each casing held the power to level a city, and the Russians were close enough to touch them. One of the operators checked his watch. The red digits showed 3 hours and 12 minutes since they had crossed the outer wire. Their mission was not to destroy. Their mission was to prove that the heart of NATO was vulnerable. They sat in the dark. The only sound, the faint hum of the vault's ventilation system. The lead operator reached out and placed a small, magnetic device on the side of the nearest warhead. It was a digital calling card, a signature that would be found long after they were gone. Back in the security center, Thorn picked up the internal radio. He did not use the main channel. He used the encrypted secondary line. He called for the Quick Reaction Force. He told them to move to the north sector immediately. He told them to bring the heavy breaching gear and the thermal optics. His voice was a low, jagged whisper. He knew that if the intruders could bypass the cameras, they could probably intercept the base radio. The room smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Thorn felt the sweat slicking his palms against the plastic of the desk. He looked at the main monitor. The footage showed a long, empty corridor of white concrete and fluorescent lights. It was a lie. The Spetsnaz had installed a physical bypass on the fiber optic line 3 hours ago. The security team had been watching a recording of a peaceful night while an enemy team worked in the dark. In the vault, the lead Russian operator felt a vibration in his ear canal. It was his bone conduction radio. A single click. Then, another. It was the signal from their external support team waiting in the woods outside the base. The extraction window was opening. He stood up. His movements were fluid and practiced. He did not make a sound. His gear was taped down to prevent any metallic rattle. He signaled to his team with 2 fingers. They began to move toward the inner seal. They had 3 minutes to reach the exit point before the next security patrol was scheduled to pass the outer door. They did not know about the biometric sensor. They did not know that Master Sergeant Thorn was watching their heartbeats like a hawk watching a field. Thorn watched the green lines on his screen begin to move. The heartbeats were speeding up. The intruders were heading for the door. He slammed his hand down on the emergency lockdown override. The heavy magnets in the vault doors engaged with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The sound echoed through the entire underground complex. A massive, metallic boom. The Russians stopped instantly. The lead operator looked at the door. He saw the red light above the frame flicker to life. The silent phase of the mission was over. He reached for the suppressed rifle slung across his chest. He did not need to give an order. His men already had their weapons up. They transitioned from ghosts to hunters in the blink of an eye. Above ground, the base erupted. The sirens began to wail, a low, guttural moan that cut through the sound of the rain. The floodlights snapped on, bleaching the wet tarmac white. Armed men in tan plate carriers began to sprint toward the bunker entrance. The hunt was on. 11 at night. The dense tree line at the edge of the Black Forest. The 4 Russian operators lay flat in the freezing mud, their gray-green combat suits blending into the rain-slicked earth. To any thermal camera, they were invisible, their body heat trapped beneath layers of specialized insulation. The perimeter fence of the weapons storage area was exactly 40 meters away. Beyond that fence lay the most sensitive ground in Europe. The lead operator, known only as Ruslan, adjusted his ANPVS-31 night vision goggles. The world turned a grainy, high-contrast green. He watched the rhythmic sweep of the security cameras. Every 45 seconds, there was a blind spot in the rotation, near the western corner of the outer perimeter. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine needles and the distant, metallic tang of jet fuel from the main runways. He raised a gloved hand, 2 fingers extended. The team moved. They did not run. They flowed across the open ground like a single dark liquid. One operator carried a heavy, padded case containing a fiber optic injector. They reached the first fence in 12 seconds. Ruslan did not use wire cutters. Instead, the second operator applied a specialized chemical compound to the base of the steel mesh. The metal dissolved silently, creating a hole just large enough for a man to slide through. There was no sound but the constant, drumming rhythm of the German rain against the gravel. Once inside the first perimeter, they encountered the microwave sensors. These were invisible barriers that would trigger a base-wide alarm if even a bird flew through them. The third operator, the technician, knelt in the mud and pulled a handheld tablet from his chest rig. He tapped into a junction box hidden beneath a concrete lip. He wasn't hacking the system, he was mirroring it. He injected a looped signal into the microwave array, telling the security computer that the sector was empty and still. The computer believed the lie. The 4 men walked through the invisible wall of energy without a single light flashing in the security center. They reached the primary vault entrance at midnight. This was the most dangerous part of the insertion. The vault door was a massive slab of reinforced steel and concrete, controlled by a dual-key system and a biometric scanner. Ruslan pulled a small, glass-faced device from his pouch. It was a high-resolution thermal reconstructor. An hour earlier, a local asset working inside the base had used the scanner. The heat signature of the technician's thumbprint was still faintly visible on the glass. The Russian device scanned the residual heat, mapped the ridges of the print, and projected a perfect 3-dimensional replica back onto the scanner's surface. The lock hissed. The internal pressure equalized. With a soft, pneumatic sigh, the door began to swing open, a 3-ton weight moving on greased hinges. They stepped into the tomb-like silence of the bunker. The air inside was sterile, filtered, and bone-dry. It smelled of ozone and the heavy, industrial scent of hydraulic fluid. The long corridor stretched out before them, lit by low-intensity red tactical lights. They moved in a diamond formation, suppressed rifles leveled at the shadows. Every footstep was placed with surgical precision. They were now inside the black zone. For the next 2 hours, the Russians were the masters of the vault. They moved through the secondary security layers with practiced ease. They bypassed the motion sensors by moving at a pace so slow the software filtered them out as environmental drift. They reached the inner sanctum, where the B-61 tactical nuclear bombs were stored in their steel cradles. These weapons were the backbone of the Alliance's nuclear deterrent. Ruslan stood in the center of the room, looking at the rows of gray casings. He did not feel fear. He felt a cold, professional satisfaction. He signaled for the technician to begin the data harvest. They spent the next 90 minutes tapping into the vault's internal diagnostic bus. They weren't looking for launch codes. They were looking for maintenance logs and sensor specifications. They wanted to know exactly how NATO looked after its most lethal assets. The technician's tablet hummed softly as it sucked gigabytes of encrypted data through the physical hardline. The only sound in the room was the faint, rhythmic clicking of the cooling fans inside the bomb cradles. The Spetsnaz team sat in the dark, their heartbeats slow and steady. They were 3 hours into the mission, and they were still ghosts. Ruslan checked his watch. It was 2 in the morning. The extraction window was approaching. He reached out and placed the magnetic calling card on the side of the lead warhead. It was a small, black disc, no larger than a coin. It would serve as a permanent reminder that the Russian Federation could touch the untouchable. He signaled for the team to pack up. They began their retreat, moving back toward the primary door. They had been inside for 180 minutes without a single person on the base knowing they existed. They were 10 feet from the exit when the world changed. The heavy magnets of the door suddenly slammed home. The sound was a violent, metallic crash that tore through the silence of the bunker. The red lights in, the ceiling began to pulse rapidly. The Spetsnaz team froze. Ruslan looked at his team, his eyes hard behind his goggles. The silence was over. The ghost mission had just become a fight for survival. 2:05 in the morning. The main gate of the weapons storage area. 12 armored trucks screamed across the wet tarmac, their tires throwing up plumes of cold spray. They formed a tight semicircle around the reinforced entrance to Vault 7. The 86th Security Forces Squadron was on the ground in under 60 seconds. Captain Miller hit the pavement. Before his driver had even fully cut the engine, the air was freezing and heavy with the smell of diesel smoke and ozone. Above them, the sky was a bruised purple, torn by the rotating beams of a dozen searchlights. Miller looked at the massive steel door of the bunker. It was shut tight, 1,000 tons of concrete and metal between his men and the intruders. The red emergency lights above the door were flashing in a steady, rhythmic pulse. "Seal it!" Miller barked into his radio. "I want every vent, every pipe, and every cable run blocked." He didn't wait for a response. He watched as his teams moved with practiced, lethal efficiency. 4 airmen lugged heavy steel plates toward the ventilation shafts. They bolted them down, with pneumatic wrenches that rattled like machine guns in the quiet night. Inside the vault, the world went black for 3 heartbeats. The Spetsnaz team stood frozen in the dark. Then, the emergency lighting kicked in, bathing the gray walls in a dim, sickly red glow. Ruslan, the lead operator, felt the air pressure change in his ears. He knew that sensation. The external air intake had been cut. They were now breathing the oxygen already inside the vault. They had perhaps 4 hours before the carbon dioxide levels became a problem. "Comms check," Ruslan whispered. His bone conduction radio crackled with static. The Americans had activated the localized jamming arrays. The Russian team was now completely isolated from their support team in the forest. They were alone in the heart of the enemy's den. Back at the surface, Miller stood at the mobile command post. He stared at the blueprints of Vault 7 on a ruggedized laptop screen. "We have them boxed in," his sergeant said, his voice tight. "They have nowhere to go, Captain. No air, no radio, no exit." Miller didn't look up. He knew it wasn't that simple. He was dealing with professionals who had bypassed the most expensive security system in the world. They wouldn't just sit in the dark and wait to be handcuffed. "Cut the main power," Miller ordered. "I want them blind." "Sir, the cooling systems for the warheads. The backup batteries will hold the temperature for 6 hours," Miller interrupted. "I want the intruders' night vision to struggle. Cut the juice, now." A second later, the faint hum of the vault's transformers died. The red lights inside, the bunker flickered and vanished. The darkness was now absolute. It was a thick, heavy weight that pressed against the eyes. Ruslan reached up and flipped his goggles down. The world reappeared in shades of neon green and ghostly white. He could see the heat rising from his men's bodies in faint, shimmering clouds. He could see the cold, dead metal of the nuclear casings. He signaled for his team to move away from the main door. They retreated into the secondary storage corridors, a maze of narrow concrete halls. They moved silently, their boots barely touching the floor. They were looking for a choke point. If the Americans wanted to come inside, they would have to come through a narrow throat. On the surface, the QRF teams were stacking up at the primary breach point. Miller watched them on the tactical feed. 30 men in heavy black ceramic plates, carrying M4 carbines and G36 rifles. They looked like Roman legionnaires in modern armor. They were the best NATO had to offer, and they were furious. The sense of violation was palpable. An enemy had walked into their house while they were sleeping. "Breaching team, report," Miller said. "Charges are set. Captain, we are ready to blow the outer seal on your command." Miller looked at the clock. It was 2:15 in the morning. The intruders had been inside for 3 hours and 15 minutes. Every second he waited was a second they used to prepare their defense. He felt the rain stinging his face, cold and persistent. The sound of the base sirens was a constant, low-frequency throb in his skull. "Do it," Miller said. The order was simple. The result was a roar that shook the ground. A massive ring of white fire erupted around the perimeter of the vault door. The shock wave threw a cloud of dust and pulverized concrete 50 feet into the air. The heavy steel door didn't fall. It groaned as the locking pins were sheared off by the force of the explosive. A thick cloud of gray smoke billowed out of the opening, smelling of burnt cordite. "Go! Go! Go!" The first NATO team vanished into the smoke, their weapon lights cutting through the haze like white swords. They moved into the throat of the bunker, their boots crunching on the shattered concrete. The hunt had moved from the rain-soaked tarmac into the dry, dead silence of the vault. The two most elite forces in the world were now in the same dark box. Only one side was coming out. 2:20 in the morning. The secondary ventilation corridor of Vault 7. The lead NATO element pushed through the settling dust of the breach, their boots crunching on fragments of pulverized concrete. White weapon lights cut through the swirling haze, reflecting off the damp, gray walls. The air was thick with the sharp, chemical bite of burnt cordite and the smell of ancient dust. 20 meters ahead, the corridor turned sharply to the left. The silence was absolute for exactly 4 seconds. Then, the darkness erupted. The sharp, rhythmic bark of an AK-12 rifle tore through the stillness. Green tracer rounds whipped through the smoke, slamming into the concrete wall inches from the lead NATO airman's head. Sparks flew as the bullets chewed into the aggregate. The NATO team dove for cover, their G36 carbines roaring back in a deafening wall of sound. The corridor became a tunnel of white and orange muzzle flashes. The noise was a physical weight, hammering against their eardrums. In the confined space, "Contact! Front!" the NATO squad leader screamed. He leaned around the corner and fired a controlled 3-round burst. He saw a shadow flicker in the red glow of the emergency lights. The Russian Spetsnaz were no longer ghosts. They were professional killers fighting for a way out. They were moving with a terrifying, fluid speed. One Russian operator rolled across the open corridor, firing a suppressed AK-12 with one hand while tossing a flashbang with the other. The device detonated with a bone-shaking crack. A wall of magnesium white light bleached the corridor. The NATO lead scout staggered back, his vision a blurred smear of purple and white. He felt the heat of the blast wash over his face. His ears were ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. He felt a hand grab his plate carrier and drag him back behind the steel lip of a junction box. The Russians did not wait for the smoke to clear. They used the confusion to leapfrog backward toward the Commandant Central Storage Hall. They were moving toward the nuclear warheads. Zaslon knew the Americans would not use heavy explosives near the B-61 casings. The vault itself was now his best shield. He fired another burst, the brass casings clattering onto the floor like heavy rain. The smell of hot metal and ozone was overwhelming. Master Sergeant Thorne watched the tactical feed from the security center. He saw the thermal signatures of the two teams clashing. In the narrow throat of the vault, the Russian heartbeats were no longer steady. They were spiking, hitting 140 beats per minute. The NATO team was pushing hard, trying to use their superior numbers to overwhelm the choke point. "Alpha team, push the left flank," Thorne commanded over the radio. "They are trying to lure you into the main hall. Do not let them get behind the cradles." The NATO team leader signaled for a smoke grenade. He popped the pin and rolled the canister down the hallway. Thick, gray-white smoke hissed out, filling the corridor in seconds. He checked his thermal optics. The Russian signatures were glowing bright orange through the haze. Engagement range, 15 meters, he whispered into his comms. Fire on my mark. The NATO team surged forward into the smoke. They were moving in a low, aggressive crouch. They reached the turn in the corridor and found it empty. The only thing left was a pile of spent 5.45mm casings and a smear of fresh blood on the wall. The Spetsnaz had vanished back into the labyrinth. The red emergency lights pulsed once, twice, then stayed on. The silence returned, but it was a heavy, predatory quiet. Outside, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour. The sound of the water hitting the bunker's exhaust grates was a dull roar. Miller stood at the command post, his face illuminated by the blue light of the monitors. "Therein, the inner sanctum," he said. He looked at the blueprints. The Russians were now backed against the most dangerous objects on the continent. The tactical situation had just shifted from a sweep and clear to a hostage crisis, where the hostages were nuclear weapons. Every shot fired from this moment on carried the risk of a catastrophic breach. The air in the command center felt thin. The fight was moving into its most lethal phase. 2:25 in the morning. The inner threshold of the primary storage hall. The air was freezing, vibrating with the low, heavy hum of the backup power generators. 20 meters of open concrete floor lay between the NATO breach team and the first row of nuclear cradles. The red emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the white-painted floor. Master Sergeant Thorne watched the thermal feed. His teeth clenched so hard, his jaw ached. The Russians were positioned behind the thick steel pedestals of the B-61 warheads. They were using the most dangerous weapons in the world as human shields. Captain Miller stood just outside the blast door, his hand hovering over his radio. He knew the rules of engagement. Standard high-explosive grenades were forbidden inside the sanctum. One stray fragment could puncture a cooling line or damage a warhead casing. "Switch to specialized munitions," Miller ordered, his voice a low growl. "Flash suppression rounds only. I want them neutralized, not vaporized." The NATO point man, a staff sergeant named Vance, checked the chamber of Vost, his underbarrel launcher. He slid a specialized 40mm white phosphorus-free distraction round into the tube. The metal clicked home with a cold, final sound. The air in the corridor smelled of wet wool and the sharp, metallic tang of the breach. Vance felt the sweat stinging his eyes. He took one deep breath and stepped into the frame of the open vault door. The trigger was squeezed. The distraction round shrieked from the launcher, a blue-white streak of light tearing through the red gloom of the vault. The projectile flew across the open space, leaving a trail of gray smoke that smelled of magnesium and sulfur. It moved with a high-pitched scream that echoed off the reinforced concrete walls. The round slammed directly into the concrete pillar 6 inches above the lead Russian's head. The impact was a shattering crack that sent a spray of stone splinters flying. Like shrapnel, a blinding orb of white light erupted, bleaching the entire hall. The heat from the chemical reaction washed over the Russians' position, reaching temperatures of 2,000 degrees for a fraction of a second. The Russian operator was thrown violently sideways by the concussive force. His night vision goggles were instantly burned out by the light, leaving him blind and screaming in the dark. He scrambled backward, his gloved hands clawing at the concrete as he tried to find his rifle. His teammate leaned out from behind a warhead cradle and opened fire. In a blind, panicked arc, the bullets chewed into the floor, sending sparks flying toward the NATO team. Thick, gray smoke boiled toward the ceiling, obscuring the rows of nuclear weapons. The sound of the explosion was replaced by a high-frequency ringing that blotted out the shouts of the combatants. The first row of cradles was, now, a wall of fire and haze. The stalemate was broken. replaced by a chaotic scramble for position and, quote, the blinding fog. Vance didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He surged forward, his weapon light cutting a path through the haze. Move! 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 He roared, his voice cracking with the strain. The NATO team poured into the vault, spreading out into a wide skirmish line. They moved with a violent, rhythmic precision, boots hammering against the floor. They were 10 meters from the first Russian when a second AK-12 began to bark. From the shadows, the bullets tore through the air, one of them clipping the shoulder of a NATO airman. The man was spun around by the force, his rifle clattering to the floor. He went down hard, his blood bright red under the emergency lights. The smell of hot copper and burnt cloth filled the immediate area. His teammates didn't stop. They stepped over him, their G-36 rifles spitting fire in controlled, 2-round bursts. The Russian team was retreating deeper into the forest of steel cradles. They were moving toward the very back of the vault, where the ceiling was lowest. Ruslan, the Spetsnaz lead, was dragging his blinded operator by the tactical vest. He was firing his suppressed rifle with one hand, the muzzle flashes appearing as small, orange sparks in the two-set smoke. He knew he couldn't win a sustained firefight in the open. He needed to get to the secondary maintenance hatch. Back in the security center, Thorne saw the movement on his screen. Miller, they're heading for the crawl space, Thorne shouted. If they get into the cable runs, we'll have to dig them out with a spoon. Miller heard the urgency in the sergeant's voice. He looked at the tactical map. The cable runs led to the primary transformer room for the entire base. If the Russians got there, they could shut down every light and every radar in the sector. The NATO team reached the first row of warheads. They stopped, their weapon lights illuminating the gray metal skins of the bombs. The air was hot and thick, with the sight of any percent smell of spent brass. Vance looked down and saw a row of 5.45 millimeter casings. The enemy was only seconds ahead of them. "Don't let them reach the hatch," Vance screamed. He broke into a sprint, his heavy gear rattling as he dove over a low concrete divider. The fight was no longer about a vault. It was a race to prevent the total blackout of the most important base in NATO. 2:30 in the morning. The deep rear of the primary storage hall, Ruslan reached the maintenance hatch, his lungs burning from the acrid smoke and the thin, oxygen-depleted air. The hatch was a circular plate of heavy steel, secured by 6 manual locking lugs. Behind him, the blinded operator, Dmitri, was slumped against a concrete pillar, his chest heaving. Dmitri's face was a mask of red, raw skin, where the magnesium flash had cooked the air in front of him. 5 meters away, the first row of B-61 warheads stood like silent sentinels in the flickering red gloom. The sound of NATO boots was getting louder, a rhythmic pounding that vibrated through the floor. Ruslan grabbed the first lug. It was cold, slick with hydraulic oil and condensation. He yanked it upward with a grunt of pure physical effort. The metal screeched, a high-pitched protest that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. A burst of 5.45 millimeter fire from the third Russian operator, Victor, kept the Americans pinned behind the central row of cradles. Victor was firing in short, disciplined, 2-round bursts, conserving what little ammunition they had left. The brass casings rattled across the floor, glowing orange for a second, before fading into the shadows. Vance, the NATO point man, pressed his shoulder against the cold steel of a warhead pedestal. He could hear the Russian lug nuts turning. He knew that sound. If they got into the crawl space, they would be inside. The base's nervous system. Suppressive fire. Now! Vance roared. 3 G-36 rifles opened up simultaneously. The muzzle flashes were blinding, rhythmic pulses of white light that tore the darkness apart. The rounds chewed into the concrete pillar where Victor was crouched, sending a cloud of stone dust and gray chips into the air. The lead NATO airman leaned out and squeezed his trigger. A long, continuous burst of 5.56 millimeter fire driving straight into the Russian position. The heavy rounds punched into the steel hatch cover, creating a series of violent, metallic sparks that illuminated the crawlspace entrance for a fraction of a second. One round caught the heavy steel lug Ruslan was holding, shattering the handle and sending a jagged fragment of metal spinning into the dark. Ruslan felt a white-hot agony as the shrapnel sliced through his tactical glove and buried itself in his palm. He didn't scream. He let out a sharp, guttural hiss of breath as he was thrown backward by the kinetic shock. He scrambled away from the hatch, his blood painting the gray concrete a dark, oily black. The impact had sheared the locking mechanism entirely, jamming the hatch in a half-open position that was too narrow for a man to pass through. Victor, seeing his commander go down, reacted with a desperate animal speed. He abandoned his cover and lunged toward Ruslan, firing his AK-12 from the hip as he moved. He wasn't aiming. He was creating a wall of lead to buy 3 seconds of life. He grabbed Ruslan by the shoulder and dragged him into the narrow gap between two nuclear cradles. Just as a NATO flashbang detonated on the spot they had occupied a heartbeat before. The vault fell into a sudden, ringing silence that was even more terrifying than the gunfire. A thick, roiling cloud of white smoke began to swallow the back of the hull, smelling of burnt powder and ozone. The only sound was the heavy, metallic ticking of the cooling fans and the faint, wet sound of a man trying to breathe through a punctured lung. The Russian team was no longer an elite strike force. They were cornered prey, bleeding out in the dark. Vance didn't move. He waited for his vision to clear. The smell of the vault had changed. It no longer smelled like a laboratory. It smelled like a slaughterhouse. The scent of hot blood was thick and heavy, mixing with the chemical bite of the smoke. Alpha 2, report, Vance whispered into his comms. We've got him pinned, Sarge, a voice crackled back. But he's behind the number 4 casing. We can't get a clean angle without risking the asset. Vance looked at the B-61 bomb just 3 feet away from him. The gray skin was smooth, almost beautiful in its lethality. He could see the reflection of his own tactical light in the polished metal. If a stray round hit the firing mechanism or the chemical high-explosive lens inside, the vault wouldn't just explode. It would become a radioactive furnace that would contaminate the entire Rhineland-Palatinate region for decades. The weight of that reality pressed down on him like a physical mountain. In the security center, Master Sergeant Thorne watched the thermal signatures. They were static now. 2 orange blobs behind the nuclear cradles. 3 blue blobs closing in. Miller, tell Vance to hold his fire, Thorne said, his voice trembling. The carbon dioxide levels in there are spiking. The scrubbers are dead. If we don't end this in 10 minutes, everyone in that room is going to pass out. And I don't want a bunch of, quote, unconscious Russians holding live nukes. Miller stood in the rain, his face illuminated by the blue light of the command screen. He looked at the clock. 2:35 in the morning. The world was still asleep, unaware that the fate of the continent was being decided in a concrete box by 5 men who were almost out of air. Vance, Miller said, his voice flat and cold. The soft approach is over. Use the gas. I don't care if they never wake up. Just get them away from those bombs. Vance reached for the canister on his belt. It was a specialized incapacitant designed for closed environments. He looked at the smoke-filled darkness where the Russians were hiding. He knew they were watching him. He knew they were waiting for him to make a mistake. He pulled the pin. The metal ring felt cold against his finger. The silence of the vault felt like a held breath. 2:37 in the morning. The primary storage hall of Vault 7. Vance threw the canister with a sharp, overhand motion. The small metal cylinder skittered across the gray concrete, the sound like a heavy coin spinning on a tabletop. It bounced once, off the base of a nuclear cradle, and came to a stop exactly 10 feet from the Russian position. For 2 seconds, there was only the sound of the cooling fans. Then, a sharp, pneumatic hiss tore through the silence. A thick, yellow-white fog began to boil out of the canister vents. It did not rise like smoke. It was heavy, a dense chemical vapor that rolled across the floor like an incoming tide. The smell hit the NATO team even through their tactical filters, a sharp, sweet scent. like rotting fruit mixed with the bite of industrial bleach. This was a specialized incapacitant, a derivative of fentanyl mixed with a rapid-onset paralytic. In the confined, unventilated space of the vault, it acted with a terrifying, invisible speed. Ruslan saw the fog rolling toward him. He knew he had 4 seconds, perhaps 5, before his nervous system began to shut down. He reached for the gas mask in his thigh pocket, his fingers clumsy and numb from the shrapnel wound in his palm. His blood, dark and thick, slicked the rubber straps of the mask. Beside him, Victor was already pulling his own mask over his face, his breathing coming in jagged, panicked gulps. The blinded operator, Dmitri, was not as fast. He inhaled a lungful of the yellow mist and immediately slumped against the concrete wall. His rifle fell from his hands, the metal clattering against the floor, with a sound that seemed a mile away. Vance watched through his thermal goggles. The world was a hazy, vibrating green. He saw the orange heat signatures of the Russians begin to blur as the gas interfered with the thermal sensors. Masks on! Go! 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 Vance commanded. The NATO teams snapped their respirators into place. The sound of their breathing changed instantly, a rhythmic, mechanical hiss thud that echoed inside their helmets. They moved into the fog, their weapon lights creating solid beams of white light. In the thick chemical soup, they were no longer walking, they were hunting in a ghost world. The yellow vapor was so thick that Vance could barely see his own gloved hand on the foregrip of his rifle. He felt the weight of the air, a heavy, humid pressure against his chest. He stepped over a discarded Russian equipment bag, his boots silent on the concrete. He was 5 meters from the lead B-61 warhead when he saw a shadow move. Ruslan was on his knees, his mask only half secured. His vision was tunneling, the red emergency lights of the vault turning into distant, fading sparks. He saw the white beam of a NATO weapon light cutting through the fog. He didn't reach for his rifle. It was too heavy, a leaden weight he could no longer lift. Instead, he reached for the small, black disc he had placed on the warhead casing earlier. It wasn't a bomb, but it was his only remaining lever. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the nuke. Vance saw the motion. He didn't fire. He lunged forward, the weight of his plate carrier and gear lending him the momentum of a charging bull. He slammed into Ruslan, the 2 men hitting the concrete floor with a violent, metallic crash. The air was knocked out of Ruslan's lungs. In a single, wet gasp, Vance pinned the Russian's wounded hand to the floor, his knee grinding into the man's chest. "Don't move! Don't you dare move!" Vance screamed, his voice distorted by the respirator. Behind them, the rest of the NATO team moved with lethal efficiency. 2 airmen tackled Victor, the 3rd Russian, before he could bring his AK-12 to bear. They drove him into the side of a concrete pillar, the sound of the impact echoing through the hall. They stripped the weapon from his hands and forced his head down into the cooling fog. Within seconds, the paralytic took hold. Victor's body went limp, his muscles refusing to obey the frantic commands of his brain. The primary storage hall fell into a heavy, artificial silence. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical breathing of the NATO team and the dying hiss of the gas canister. The yellow fog began to settle, coating the gray nuclear warheads in a fine, chemical dust. The air smelled of ozone, blood, and the sweet, sickly scent of the incapacitant. The Russians lay on the floor, their eyes open but unseeing, their bodies frozen in the final moments of the struggle. Vance stayed on top of Ruslan for a full minute, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at the Russian's face. Ruslan was staring back at him, his pupils dilated to pinpricks, his breathing shallow and ragged. There was no anger in the Russian's eyes. There was only a cold, professional exhaustion. Vance reached out and pulled the small black disc off the B-61 warhead. He held it up to his weapon light. It was a simple transmitter, no larger than a coin. It wasn't a detonator. It was a beacon. The Russians hadn't come here to blow the base up. They had come here to show the world they could touch the heart of the sun and walk away.
Status
"Vault 7 is secure," Vance said into his comms. His voice was shaking. The adrenaline finally beginning to recede. "We have 3 subjects down. 1 wounded. All assets are intact." Outside, the sirens continued to wail, a distant, lonely sound in the German night. The rain continued to hammer against the concrete roof 60 feet above their heads. But inside the vault, the war was over. The ghosts had been caught, 2:45 in the morning. The main heavy lift elevator of Vault 7. The extraction team moved in a tight, overlapping formation of black tactical gear and respirators. The vault was finally silent, but the air was a toxic soup of chemicals and cold dust. Vance stood over the 3 prone figures of the Russian Spetsnaz team. The yellow gas was settling into a fine, crystalline powder on the gray concrete floor. It looked like a light dusting of sulfur under the flickering red emergency lights. The smell of the incapacitant was still strong, a sweet, sickly floral scent that cut through the filters. The elevator doors groaned open with a heavy, industrial screech of metal on metal. 6 men from the elite medical emergency response group stepped out. They carried collapsible carbon fiber litters and specialized monitoring equipment. They moved with the speed of men who knew the air they were breathing was a ticking clock. "Check the wounded man first," Vance ordered, pointing his weapon light at the blinded operator, Dmitri. He took the brunt of the magnesium flash and the gas. The medics knelt in the yellow dust, their movements sharp and mechanical. They rolled Dmitri onto his back. His face was a raw, angry red, the skin blistering where the heat had caught him. His eyes were swollen shut, weeping a clear, thin fluid. The lead medic pressed a biometric sensor to the Russian's neck. "Heart rate is 60 and dropping," the medic said, his voice muffled by his mask. "The paralytic is hitting his respiratory center. We need to intubate him now." The sound of a plastic tube sliding into a throat was a wet, rhythmic clicking in the silence. Vance watched them work, his rifle still leveled at the other 2 Russians. Ruslan, the Spetsnaz lead, was still conscious but paralyzed. His eyes followed every movement of the NATO team with a cold, detached intensity. He looked like a statue carved from gray stone, his only sign of life, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Vance saw the blood from the Russian's hand had pooled into a dark, jagged shape on the floor. It looked like a map of a country that no longer existed. "Get them out of here," Captain Miller's voice crackled over the radio. "I want the vault clear in 5 minutes. The nuclear safety team is at the gate. They won't enter until the intruders are off the premises," Vance signaled to his men. They grabbed the handles of the litters and began to haul the Russians toward the elevator. The weight of the men and their combat gear was a heavy, physical strain. The air in the vault was getting thinner as the scrubbers remained offline. Vance felt a dull, pulsing ache behind his eyes. They loaded the prisoners into the elevator car. The space was cramped, filled with the smell of wet wool, blood, and chemical gas. The heavy steel doors slid shut with a final, echoing thud. The lift began to rise, the cables humming with a high-pitched, vibrating whine. Vance looked at the floor of the elevator. A single drop of Russian blood had fallen onto his boot. It was a bright, vivid crimson against the black leather. The elevator reached the surface level, and the doors hissed open. The cold German rain slammed into them instantly, a wall of freezing water that smelled of pine and ozone. The transition from the dry, chemical tomb of the vault to the wet night was a physical shock. The searchlights of the base were still sweeping the tarmac, turning the rain into sheets of falling silver. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters sat 20 meters away, their rotors turning in a low, rhythmic growl. The downwash from the blades whipped the rain into a frenzied spray that stung Vance's exposed skin. The medical team sprinted across the wet concrete, their boots splashing through deep puddles. They loaded the Russians into the back of the first helicopter. The interior of the bird was bathed in a dim, tactical green light. "Go, go, go!" a crew chief screamed over the roar of the engines. The MH-60 Sierra lifted off within seconds, its nose dipping as it clawed for altitude. The sound of the rotors faded into the distance, leaving only the roar of the rain and the howl of the base sirens. Vance stood on the tarmac, his respirator finally hanging around his neck. The cold air felt like a miracle in his lungs. He watched the second helicopter depart with his wounded NATO teammate. The base was a hive of activity, with armored trucks and fuel bowsers moving in every direction. He looked back at the entrance to Vault 7. The nuclear safety team, dressed in white radiation suits, was already moving toward the breach. They looked like ghosts returning to a haunted house. Captain Miller walked up to Vance, his face gray with exhaustion. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the wet, blood-stained boots of his point man. "The disc you found," Miller finally said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Intelligence is looking at it now." It wasn't just a beacon. It was a high-frequency uplink. They were broadcasting everything. Vance, the layout, the sensor gaps, the response times. Every second they were in there, Moscow was watching through their eyes. Vance felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the rain. The Russians hadn't lost. They had finished their recording. The vault was secure. But the secret was gone. 3 in the morning. The interior of Vault 7. The nuclear safety team moved like slow, white beetles through the settling, yellow dust. The air was still heavy with the scent of the incapacitant, a cloying sweetness that refused to dissipate. Despite the industrial fans now roaring at full power, Captain Miller stood at the threshold, a heavy rubber respirator masking his face, watching the forensic specialists scrape Russian blood from the side of a B-61 warhead. The gray concrete was a graveyard of spent brass and shattered glass, illuminated by the harsh, blue-white glare of portable floodlights. "Sir, you need to see this," a technician called out. His voice was a metallic rasp through his mask's diaphragm. Miller stepped over a discarded Russian tactical vest, the fabric shredded by NATO fire. The technician was kneeling near the primary fiber optic junction box, the one the Russians had tapped 3 hours earlier. He pointed a gloved finger at a small, translucent sliver of glass and silicon. It was no larger than a fingernail, vibrating with a faint, rhythmic pulse of blue light. "It is a parasitic transceiver," the technician explained, his eyes wide behind his goggles. "They didn't just loop the video feed. They used this to inject a dormant logic bomb into the base's entire security architecture." Miller felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his chest. The smell of the vault, a mix of ozone, bleach, and the copper tang of blood, seemed to grow thicker. "What does it do?" Miller asked. "It is a sleeper program. It was designed to wait for a specific signal from Moscow. Once triggered, it would have scrambled the command and control links for every nuclear asset on the base. We wouldn't have been able to launch. We wouldn't have even been able to unlock the cradles." The realization hit Miller like a physical blow. The Spetsnaz team hadn't just been on a reconnaissance mission. They had been performing a surgical strike on the brain of the Alliance's deterrent. He looked back at the row of B-61 warheads. They were cold, silent, and suddenly very vulnerable. "Get the cyber warfare team down here," Miller barked. "I want every inch of this fiber line pulled and replaced. I want a full purge of the security mainframe. Now." Across the vault, another team was carefully bagging the Russian equipment. They handled the AK-12 rifles and the specialized thermal suits with the reverence of archaeologists. One specialist picked up a discarded Russian helmet. The visor was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures centered on a small, dark hole. The specialist didn't say anything. He just placed it in a heavy plastic evidence bag. The silence of the vault was now filled with the mechanical clatter of tools and the hiss of air scrubbers. Vance stood near the breach point, his rifle slung low. He was watching the forensic team work, his face a mask of exhaustion. The adrenaline had left his system, replaced by a deep, aching fatigue that settled into his bones. He looked at the floor where he had pinned the Russian leader, Zaslon. The yellow dust had been disturbed, showing the frantic scuffle of the final moments. He saw something glinting in the cracks of the concrete. He knelt down and picked it up. It was a small, silver crucifix on a thin, broken chain. It was stained with a single drop of dark, dried blood. Vance held it in his palm, the metal cold against his skin. He thought of the man he had seen through. The respirator, the eyes that had shown no fear, only a cold, professional resignation. The Spetsnaz were not monsters. They were the best the other side had to offer. They had traveled 1,000 miles to die in a dark box for a cause they believed in. Vance closed his hand around the cross and slid it into his pocket. The base outside was still in a state of high alert. The sound of the sirens had been replaced by the constant, low-frequency hum of armored vehicles patrolling the perimeter. The 86th Security Forces were now reinforced by a battalion of combat engineers. They were pouring fresh concrete into the breach, the wet, gray slush smelling of lime and stone. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, a fine mist that hung in the air like a shroud. Miller walked over to Vance. He took off his respirator, his face pale and drawn in the blue light. "Intelligence just got a ping from the Pans border," Miller said. 2 more Russian teams were picked up by the Germans near the border. They were waiting for SET, the signal to extract the guys in here. This wasn't a localized event, Vance. This was a coordinated test of the entire fence. Vance looked at the row of nukes. They looked smaller now, less like gods, and more like targets. "Did we pass?" Vance asked. Miller didn't answer for a long time. He looked at the technicians, working on the fiber line, their hands shaking as they pulled the Russian parasite from the wire. "We caught them," Miller said. "But they were in here for 3 hours. That is, 3 hours where the world's most powerful weapons belonged to someone else. I don't think anyone passes a test like that." The sound of a heavy transport, aircraft taking off from the main runway, tore through the night. The roar of the engines vibrated through the concrete walls of the vault. The cleanup would take days. The investigation would take months. But the silence of Vault 7 had been permanently broken. The ghosts had been caught, but they had left their shadows behind. 4:30 in the morning. The primary cooling manifold of Vault 7. The explosive ordnance disposal team moved with a slow, agonizing precision. They wore heavy, olive-drab blast suits that made them look like deep-sea divers in the red light. The air was thick with the smell of anti-static spray and the sharp, chemical tang of the settling gas. The lead technician, Staff Sergeant Holloway, knelt beside the secondary coolant line. His handheld scanner was emitting a low, frantic chirping sound. "I have a secondary signature," Holloway said. His voice was tight, echoing inside his thick plastic visor. Captain Miller watched from the breach point, his hands clenched at his sides. The nuclear safety team had cleared the warheads, but the facility was still a minefield. The Spetsnaz had been inside for 3 hours. That was more than enough time to leave a parting gift for the cleanup crew. The vault felt smaller now, the reinforced walls pressing in on them. Holloway reached behind the heavy steel manifold with a pair of long-reach pliers. He moved at a pace that was almost painful to watch. He pulled back a small, black rectangle of plastic and wire. It was stuck to the vibrating coolant pipe with industrial-grade adhesive. "It is not an explosive," Holloway whispered, his breath fogging his visor. "It is a localized electromagnetic pulse generator. It is on a timer." Miller stepped forward, his boots crunching on a fragment of Russian visor glass. "What is the countdown?" 2 minutes, Holloway replied. The realization hit the room like a physical shock. If that device triggered, it would fry every circuit in the vault. It would wipe the diagnostic logs, the security footage, and the evidence of the Russian intrusion. Moscow didn't just want the data. They wanted to erase the proof of how they got it. The air in the vault seemed to vibrate with the hum of the cooling fans. The smell of hot electronics and ozone was overwhelming. "Can you neutralize it?" Miller asked. Holloway didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the thin, silver wires woven into the plastic casing. The device was designed to be tamper-proof. One wrong move would trigger the pulse instantly. "I need to bypass the capacitor," Holloway said. He reached for a small, specialized ceramic cutter. His gloved hands were steady, despite the 50 pounds of armor weighing him down. The silence in the vault was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the cooling manifold and the heavy breathing of the EOD team. Holloway placed the cutter against the primary lead. He squeezed. There was a sharp, metallic snap. A single blue spark jumped from the device, illuminating the dark corner for a millisecond. The chirping from the scanner stopped instantly. The red countdown light on the device flickered once and went dark. "It is dead," Holloway said. He slumped back against the concrete wall, his chest heaving. The tension in the room snapped like a stretched wire. Miller let out a long, jagged breath. "Bag it. I want the lab to see if they can pull a serial number off the components." The technicians moved in, their weapon lights sweeping the floor for any other surprises. They found 3 more devices hidden in the cable runs and the ventilation grates. The Spetsnaz had been thorough. They had prepared to burn the house down behind them. Vance stood by the elevator, watching the crates of evidence being loaded. The yellow chemical dust was being vacuumed into sealed canisters. The vault was slowly returning to its sterile, white state. But the air still felt wrong. It felt like a place where a ghost had been and might return. Vance reached into his pocket and felt the cold metal of the silver crucifix. He thought of the Russians being flown to a black site for interrogation. The physical fight was over, but the war of information was just beginning. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to gray the horizon. The rain had stopped, leaving the tarmac of the airbase shimmering and black. The searchlights were finally being cut, one by one. Miller walked out of the bunker and took a deep pull of the cold morning air. It tasted of wet pine and diesel. He looked toward the main runway, where a C-37 transport was idling. The intelligence officers had arrived from Washington. The debriefing was going to be long, cold, and brutal. The security of the alliance had been breached, and someone was going to have to explain how 4 men walked into the sun and touched the fire. 5 in the morning. The high-security medical wing of the Underground Command Center at Ramstein. Captain Miller stood behind a sheet of reinforced plexiglass, staring at the man strapped to the heavy steel gurney. Ruslan, the lead Russian operator, was awake, though his body remained largely immobile from the effects of the paralytic gas. His eyes, a cold and piercing blue, were fixed on the ceiling light with an intensity that made Miller's skin crawl. The room smelled of sharp antiseptic, ozone from the monitoring equipment, and the faint, lingering scent of the woods. What Miller was about to hear would change the definition of the word security forever. Beside Miller stood a man in a dark, well-tailored suit, who had arrived on the C-37 transport 20 minutes ago. His name was Marcus Reed, an analyst from the Central Intelligence Agency's Special Activities Center. Reed didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a librarian, but his eyes were as hard as the concrete walls of the vault. "He isn't going to talk, Captain," Reed said, his voice a low, dry rasp. "Men like him don't break in an interrogation room. They break in the field, or not at all." Miller didn't look away from the Russian. "We found their parasitic tap. We found the EMP timers. We neutralized the logic bomb." Reed let out a short, hollow laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "That is what they wanted you to find, Miller," Reed said. He tapped a glass tablet, and a series of high-speed data streams scrolled across the screen in green text. The logic bomb was a loud, clumsy distraction designed to keep your cyber teams busy for the next 48 hours. While your people were patting themselves on the back for finding the parasite, a secondary passive transmitter was already finished. Miller felt a cold, hollow sensation in his chest. The air in the observation room felt suddenly thin, as if the scrubbers had failed here too. "Finished doing what?" Miller asked. "During those 3 hours they were undetected. They weren't just looking at the bombs," Reed explained. "They were scanning the biometric signatures of every security officer who passed the outer cameras. They used a high-resolution laser microphone to record the vibrations of the keypad entries from 50 yards away. They didn't just steal the data, they stole you." Miller looked through the glass at Ruslan. The Russian's eyes slowly shifted, moving from the ceiling to fix directly on Miller's face. There was no malice in the look, only a terrifying, professional acknowledgement. They have your thumbprints, Miller, Reed continued, his voice devoid of emotion. They have the retina scans of Master Sergeant Thorne. They have the voice print of every man in the 86th Security Squadron. By the time the sun is fully up, Moscow will have a digital skeleton key for every door on this base. The realization hit Miller like a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. The battle in the vault had been a masterpiece of misdirection. The Spetsnaz team had allowed themselves to be caught because the capture was the final phase of the harvest. By engaging the NATO Quick Reaction Force, they had forced the Americans to reveal their tactical frequencies, their response times, and their medical evacuation protocols. The Russians hadn't come to blow up the vault. They had come to map the soul of the base. We have to reset every biometric lock in the European theater, Miller whispered. That will take weeks. We'll have to go back to manual keys and paper logs. Exactly, Reed said. And while we are blind and manual, they will know exactly where our gaps are. Reed looked at the Russian operator. He isn't a prisoner, Captain. He is a surveyor. And he just finished his report. In the hallway outside, the sound of heavy boots echoed off the linoleum floors. A team of federal marshals arrived to take custody of the prisoners. They moved with a grim, silent efficiency, their faces hidden behind dark visors. They unstrapped Ruslan and moved him toward a waiting armored transport. As the Russian passed the observation window, he tilted his head slightly toward Miller. It was a subtle movement, almost invisible, but the message was clear. The ghosts were gone, but they had left the doors wide open behind them. Miller watched the transport van disappear into the gray morning mist. The rain had started. Again. A soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the lines of the runway. He reached into his pocket and felt the small, silver crucifix that Vance had found in the vault. He realized now that it wasn't a religious icon. It was a piece of theater, a human touch, designed to make the Americans feel they had defeated a person rather than a system. He squeezed the metal until the edges bit into his palm. The victory at Vault 7 was a hollow shell, a carefully constructed lie that they had all swallowed whole. He turned and walked back toward the command center. The base was still humming with activity, but the energy had changed. It was no longer the frantic energy of a hunt. It was the cold, grinding realization of a total compromise. The nuclear warheads were still in their cradles, safe and untouched, but the wall that stood between the world and the fire was no longer solid. It was made of glass, and the other side was looking right through it. 5:30 in the morning. The tarmac at Ramstein Air Base. The primary blast door of Vault 7 was finally being cycled shut. For the first time since the breach, the massive steel slab moved with a low, mechanical groan that vibrated through the wet concrete. The morning light was a pale, sickly gray, filtering through a heavy blanket of low-hanging clouds. The rain had stopped, leaving the entire base dripping and cold, smelling of wet earth and spent fuel. Vance stood by the perimeter fence, his hands deep in his pockets, watching the door vanish into the hillside. The engineering teams had finished the temporary patch. On the outer wall, a square of fresh, dark concrete stood out against the weathered gray of the bunker. It looked like a scar on a face that had once been perfect. Around the vault, the security presence had tripled. 2 M1A2 tanks sat idling at the main crossroads, their turbine engines whistling in the quiet air. Their long cannons were pointed toward the forest, toward the shadows where the ghosts had come from. Captain Miller walked up to the fence line, his boots crunching on the gravel. He looked older in the morning light, the lines around his eyes etched deep with exhaustion. He held a steaming paper cup of coffee, the heat rising in a thin, white plume. He didn't look at Vance. He kept his eyes on the closing door of the vault. The base is at Delta 5 status, Miller said, his voice flat and raspy. Every person on this installation is being re-cleared. Every hard drive is being wiped. Every lock is being changed. Vance nodded slowly. He felt the weight of the silver crucifix in his pocket. It won't be enough, will it? Vance asked. Miller took a slow sip of the coffee and shook his head. No, The data they broadcast is already in a server farm in the Ural Mountains. They don't need to come back. They already have the blueprints to the house. They know how we breathe, Vance. They know how we think. The final latch of the vault door engaged with a heavy, metallic thud. The sound echoed across the valley, a single, sharp note that signaled the end of the emergency. The red lights on the bunker faded to a dull, standby glow. The sirens had long since gone silent, replaced by the mundane sounds of a base waking up. In the distance, a transport plane began its takeoff roll. The roar of the engines, a steady, comforting thunder. To the outside world, this was just another morning at the busiest airbase in Europe. Only a handful of men knew how close the sun had come to being extinguished. "What happens to the Russians?" Vance asked. Miller looked toward the main runway where the C-37 transport was disappearing into the clouds. "They'll be traded," Miller said. "Eventually. Men like Ruslan are too valuable to keep in a cage forever. Moscow will offer up a couple of our guys, and a year from now, he'll be back in the woods. He'll be training the next team. He'll be telling them about the man who pinned him in the yellow gas." Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out the crucifix. He looked at the small, blood-stained bit of silver one last time. He walked over to the edge of the perimeter fence and dropped it into the tall, wet grass. He didn't want a souvenir from the night the world almost ended. He wanted to forget the look in the Russians' eyes. He wanted to forget the smell of the sweet, rotting fruit gas. "We won the fight," Vance said, though it felt like a question. Miller turned away from the vault and looked at the long line of armored trucks patrolling the wire. "We held the ground," Miller corrected. "In this business, that is as close to a win as you get." He began to walk back toward the command center, his shoulders hunched against the damp cold. "Get some sleep, Vance. You have a meeting with the brass at noon. They want to know exactly what it felt like when the lights went out." Vance stayed by the fence for a long minute. He watched the two tanks rotate their turrets in a slow, synchronized sweep of the woods. The base was secure. The weapons were safe. The breach was sealed. But the silence of the morning felt fragile, like a sheet of thin ice over a deep, dark lake. He turned and began the long walk back to the barracks. The sun was finally breaking through the clouds, a pale, cold orb that provided no heat. The day had begun, but the shadows of Vault 7 were never going to truly leave him. The heavy steel door of the bunker remained shut. Behind it, 40 feet of reinforced concrete and 1,000 tons of earth stood guard over the fire. But for the first time in 60 years, the men on the inside knew they weren't alone. The ghosts had been caught, but the door was still unlocked.